On a single map, Peru looks like a simple shape on South America's spine. But step into it, and the country breaks into three different worlds. At once, a bone-dry coast pressed against a cold, living ocean. A wall of Andes rising so fast, the air thins in your lungs. And an Amazon that begins the moment the mountains finally loosen their grip. Somewhere up there, Lake Titicaca holds its water at 3,812 meters above sea level, an impossibility that still breathes. And beyond it, Huascarán climbs to 6,768 meters, carrying tropical sunlight over ice. What kind of land forces water and sky to live at extremes? And what kind of people learn to belong there? Peru's story begins underground, far below. The condors below, the terraces below, the stone walls that seem to cling to cliffs by sheer will. Along the western edge of South America, the planet is still negotiating its shape. A denser oceanic plate dives beneath the continent, and that slow collision is not gentle. It compresses rock like a fist, closing forces mountains upward, and feeds a chain of volcanoes and deep faults. The Andes are not a backdrop here. They are a living architecture, still rising, still cracking, still deciding where rivers will run and where humans will be allowed to settle. On the coast, the first surprise is not what you see, but what you feel. The Pacific looks bright and open, yet the air can be cool even in seasons when you expect heat. A cold current moves north along the shoreline, turning the ocean into a conveyor belt of nutrients. It helps explain a coastal paradox. Some stretches of Peru are among the driest landscapes you could stand in sand and stone under a pale sky, while the sea just a few meters away can be biologically explosive. The land starved of rain leans on the ocean's pulse. You can almost sense its salt on the wind, a thin haze hanging over the desert, and the quiet hum of a coastline that survives by keeping its temperature low and its nutrients high. Then almost abruptly, the ground begins to lift. Roads climb switchback after switchback, and the world rearranges itself by altitude. The Andes are not one uniform wall. They are a complicated set of ranges, valleys and plateaus, stitched together by geological time. Some valleys are wide enough to cradle cities. Others are narrow, carved by rivers that look harmless until rainy season arrives, and the entire canyon becomes a roaring corridor. In places, the mountains expose bands of rock like open pages layers, laid down in ancient seas, later twisted and thrust upward, now reading like a history book written in stone. Higher still, Peru enters a realm that feels almost unreal, tropical mountains that wear glaciers. In the Cordillera, Blanca snow and ice rest under a sun that can burn your skin. It is a contradiction you can taste in your breath. Cold air that seems too thin to hold warmth, while daylight is fierce and immediate. Here, the legacy of ice is written everywhere. Ancient glaciers once moved like slow blades, grinding valleys into broad U-shapes, polishing rock faces, and leaving behind amphitheaters of stone called cirques. When the ice retreated, it often left lakes in its wake, glacial water held behind natural dams of debris and moraine. Some of these lakes are calm mirrors. Others carry an unspoken tension, because when too much meltwater gathers too quickly, the mountains can release it in sudden floods. In Peru, beauty and risk sometimes share the same shoreline. And all of this Coast Canyon Glacier feeds the most important sculpture of all the rivers. Peru is defined by water's decisions. On the western side of the Andes, short rivers cut toward the Pacific, racing through dry basins where every drop matters. On the eastern side, the land tilts toward the Amazon, and streams multiply into a vast branching system that will eventually become one of Earth's greatest river networks. In certain high basins, water doesn't rush away at all. It lingers, forming high-altitude lakes that seem to float above the world, holding cold blue silence while storms gather on distant peaks. But geology isn't only about what rises. It's also about what collapses, what slides, what shakes loose. Peru sits in an active seismic zone, and the Andes are steep by nature. When rain comes hard, when tremors ripple through the ground, mountains can shed themselves in landslides, entire slopes, turning fluid roads erased in minutes villages, suddenly cut off from the rest of the country. The landscape demands respect, not through drama, but through constant negotiation. People here don't just live in a place, they live with a place, reading the clouds, watching the rivers, noticing the subtle warning signs in sound and soil. And that's the unsettling truth beneath Peru's postcard beauty. The land is still being made. The coast depends on a cold ocean's rhythm. The mountains keep lifting and fracturing. The glaciers, once thought permanent, are changing. If the ground and the water are both in motion, if the country itself is a work in progress, then what does stability even mean in Peru? To understand Peru's life, you have to understand that Peru is not one ecosystem, it is a ladder. And on that ladder, every step upward changes the rules. Temperature, oxygen, sunlight, rainfall, even the way sound travels in the air. Everything shifts. In a single day, you can move from the hush of a coastal desert to the sharp wind of high grasslands, then down into forests where the air feels thick, warm, and endlessly alive. Peru's biodiversity is not spread evenly like paint. It is stacked layered by altitude and stitched together by rivers that never stop searching for lower ground. Along the coast, life begins in a place that looks almost lifeless. Desert stretches out in pale browns and faded golds, shaped by wind and the occasional stubborn plant. But look closer, and survival becomes visible. In some seasons, fog drifts inland and feeds pockets of green, small, temporary worlds that bloom where you least expect them. It's quiet life, cautious life, the kind that survives by not wasting anything. Then, your attention is pulled back to the ocean, where the cold current keeps the water nutrient-rich. Here, the coastline can become a feeding corridor, birds circling fish, flashing marine mammals moving like shadows under the surface. Even if you never see the full spectacle, you feel its presence. The sea is not just scenery. It is a provider, an engine. Climb into the Andean valleys, and the landscape changes into something that feels more human. Terraces, fields, villages perched above rivers. These mid-elevations are where Peru often looks, the way people imagine it: steep slopes, softened by agriculture, stone walls holding the earth in place, patchwork greens catching the sun. But keep climbing, and the land becomes more severe again. Above the last trees, you enter the Puna, high-altitude grasslands that stretch like a pale ocean beneath enormous skies. The air is thinner here, sunlight sharper, nights colder. Plants grow low and tough, designed to endure frost and wind. You can hear it: grass, whispering wind, pressing against your ears, silence expanding between distant ridge lines. This is the realm of Andean wildlife built for extremes. Camelids, llamas, alpacas, vicuñas move through the grass with a calm that looks effortless, but is actually adaptation refined over millennia. Their bodies are designed to manage cold nights and intense daylight. Their movements are economical, like they've learned the highlands lesson: waste nothing. Overhead raptors ride invisible currents, scanning the slopes. And sometimes, if the sky is clear and you're far enough from roads, you might spot a condor, huge, patient, almost mythical, circling as if the mountains themselves have taken flight. Then there are the wetlands and high lakes, the places where water refuses to leave. Around them, life gathers. In the high Andes, water is power it shapes, where animals graze, where birds nest, where communities can endure. Lake Titicaca, at 3,812 meters, is not just a landmark. It is an ecological anchor in an environment that should not support such abundance. On its edges, reeds rise and sway like living walls, providing shelter, nesting grounds, and materials humans have relied on for generations. In the shallows, fish and amphibians occupy a cold world that still pulses with movement. The lake's surface can look peaceful, but at that altitude, even calm water feels like an act of defiance. And then, almost like crossing an invisible border, you descend into the cloud forests. This is where Peru becomes a different kind of loud. Moisture clings to everything, leaves rock skin breath. The forest doesn't just grow, it drips. Ferns unfurl moss carpets. Branches, orchids hide in pockets of green like secrets. Fog slides through the trees, turning the landscape into layers near and far visible and half erased. Sound changes too. In the high grasslands, the wind dominates. Here it's the forest that speaks insects, distant birds, the soft percussion of water falling leaf to leaf. Cloud forests are fragile because they depend on a specific balance altitude temperature and constant moisture. They are also incredibly rich in life. Many species live in narrow zones, adapted to a range of conditions so specific that moving a few hundred meters up or down can feel like entering a new country. This is why Peru's mountains can hold such variety. The geography creates pockets of isolation. And isolation is one of evolution's favorite tools. What emerges is a mosaic, unique plants, rare animals, and interactions that exist nowhere else in quite the same way. Follow the rivers farther down, and the forest thickens into the Amazon lowlands. Here, Peru's biodiversity becomes almost overwhelming. The canopy rises like a second sky, and beneath it is a layered world shade, filtered light, sudden clearings, the constant movement of life hunting, hiding, feeding, reproducing. The air is warm and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth and vegetation. Rivers widen, slow braid and loop. In flooded forests, trees stand in water, pillars and fish move among roots. In the Amazon, every survival strategy you can imagine is present somewhere. Some creatures rely on camouflage so perfect your eyes simply give up. Others are loud, announcing themselves because they can, because in this environment, volume can be a tool. Plants defend themselves with toxins and thorns, or they cooperate with insects and animals in exchanges that feel almost like contracts. Life here is connected in chains you don't see until something breaks. A missing predator can change the behavior of prey, which changes how plants regenerate, which changes the structure of the forest itself. The system is not just diverse, it is interdependent. And above all of this, Peru's ecosystems are now facing a shared pressure change. As temperatures shift, the ladder of life begins to move. Species that once lived comfortably at certain elevations may climb higher to find cooler air. But mountains have a limit. At the top, there is nowhere else to go. Glaciers that once acted like frozen reservoirs are thinning, altering water availability downstream, especially in dry seasons when communities depend on meltwater to keep rivers running. In the Amazon, changes in rainfall patterns can reshape flooding cycles, affecting fish breeding, forest regeneration, and human livelihoods. So Peru's biodiversity is not just a beautiful list of animals and plants, it is a living negotiation between altitude and water, between temperature and time. It is the reason this country feels like multiple worlds stitched into one. But if the ecosystems are stacked like steps, what happens when the steps begin to shift underfoot? And who feels that movement first? The animals, the forests, or the people who have always lived between them. Long before Peru became a name on a map, it was already a homeland measured not in borders, but in altitude, water, and memory. The earliest human stories here are inseparable from the land's steepness. In most places, survival means finding food. In Peru, survival also means learning where the ground allows you to stand, where the rivers can be trusted, and how to build a life on slopes that seem designed to reject permanence. Along the coast, where rain can be a rumor, early communities learned a different kind of intelligence, how to harvest the ocean's reliability, and turn scarce fresh water into stability. In river valleys cutting through desert people, shaped agriculture into narrow green corridors, cultivating and storing enough to support settlement. One of the most haunting reminders of this early ingenuity lies at Corral, an ancient urban center in the Supa Valley, where monumental architecture rose in a landscape that looks at first glance too dry to hold a city. The lesson is quiet, but sharp in Peru. Civilization did not always begin in lush places. Sometimes it began where discipline was the only way to survive. Further inland, the Andes demanded an even harsher bargain. The mountains offered water, glaciers, springs, high lakes, but they also imposed cold nights, thin air, and seasons that could break a harvest in a single storm. The response was not to flee, but to adapt with precision. Over centuries, Andean peoples developed a way of living that treated elevation like a resource. Instead of relying on one field, they cultivated multiple ecological bands, planting different crops at different heights, timing harvests like a calendar carved into the mountainside. Terraces became more than farming tools. They were engineering insurance and culture all at once. Stone walls holding soil in place, trapping warmth, preventing erosion, and turning steep slopes into usable space. And food itself became a language of resilience. Potatoes, for example, were not simply grown here. They were diversified into countless varieties, each suited to a specific microclimate, soil, and altitude. High in the cold, communities developed preservation methods that could stretch nutrition across seasons. Storage systems, both physical and social, formed the backbone of survival. Granaries shared labor obligations that turned individuals into networks. In a landscape where one family could be wiped out by an unlucky frost, cooperation became a technology. Spiritual life rose alongside practical life, because the Andes do not feel like empty rock. They feel alive. Peaks dominate the horizon like watchful beings. Storms arrive with theatrical force. Rivers carve canyons that look too deep to have been made by water alone. In many early Andean traditions, the landscape was not separate from society. It was part of it. Mountains could be protectors. Water could be sacred. Certain places carried power that required respect, offering safety one year and danger the next. And in that worldview, the question wasn't whether nature was beautiful. The question was whether nature was listening. This relationship shaped how people moved and traded. Peru's early cultures did not exist as isolated pockets forever. Valleys connected to plateaus, highlands connected to forests, coastlines connected to mountain passes. Over time, exchange routes formed paths where goods and ideas traveled coastal resources, moving inland, highland textiles and crops, moving outward jungle products, appearing in mountain settlements, like messages from a warmer world. The Andes are often imagined as barriers, but they were also bridges if someone knew how to read them. Centers of influence emerged and expanded not always as empires, but as cultural magnets. Chavin de Huantar, set in the highlands, is often discussed as a powerful ceremonial site, one that suggests how belief could unify distant communities. People traveled not just for trade, but for meaning. Ritual art and architecture carved in stone carried symbols that repeated across regions, hinting at shared myths and shared fears. In Peru, power did not always announce itself with armies first. Sometimes it arrived through pilgrimage, through iconography, through the quiet spread of an idea that felt bigger than one village's horizon. And then there was the constant pressure of the environment. In the high Andes, drought and cold were enemies. In lower valleys, floods and mudslides could erase what was built. Along the coast, scarcity was always waiting. These pressures did something profound. They made time feel urgent. When harvests depend on seasonal precision and survival depends on stored food, societies learn to plan. They learn to remember. They learn to create systems that can outlast a single life. You can feel it in the architecture walls, designed to stand terraces, designed to endure, pathways designed to connect. Early Peru is filled with evidence of humans trying to prove that permanence is possible, even in a land still being shaped by tectonics and weather. But there is another side to this story, one that is often softened in romantic retellings. Adaptation is not always gentle. Building terraces means moving stone. Irrigating valleys means controlling water. Coordinating labor means someone decides who works when and for what reward. Early Andean life involved cooperation, yes, but also hierarchy, negotiation, and conflict. Scarcity can unite people, and it can divide them. The same mountain that protects a valley can also isolate it. The same river that feeds crops can also become a boundary worth fighting over. Still, what remains remarkable is the continuity of knowledge. Across centuries, Andean communities became experts in microclimates, reading small changes in cloud cover, wind direction, and soil moisture as signals. They built a cultural memory that treated the environment as something to study, not just endure. Even in places where written records did not survive, in the way modern societies recognize the land itself became an archive. Terraces and canals are stories. Footpaths are stories. The placement of settlements, high enough to avoid floods, near enough to water to survive, is a story written in geography. And through all of this, Peru's earliest cultures created something that would later define the region's identity, a belief that human life is not separate from landscape, but threaded into it. People belong to valleys, not just to families. They belong to mountains, not just to villages. And that sense of belonging shaped everything that followed. Because when later powers rose, when larger political systems formed, they inherited not a blank slate, but a world already textured by adaptation, ritual engineering, and survival, and so when Peru's later history introduces grander names and larger empires, it is not a sudden beginning. It is an expansion of patterns that were already present. The foundations were set long before the mastery of altitude, the discipline of water, the social logic of shared labor, and the spiritual intimacy with mountains that never let humans forget how small they are. By the time the Inca rose to power, Peru was already a land of experienced survivors, people who understood that the Andes reward organization and punish improvisation. The Inca did not invent Andean life from nothing. They inherited it, sharpened it, and scaled it until the mountains themselves seemed woven into a single political fabric. Their genius was not simply conquest. It was logistics in impossible terrain, an empire assembled without relying on wheeled transport, the way many other civilizations did, yet still able to move food messages, soldiers, and ideas across enormous distances of rock and sky. The true spine of that system was not a palace. It was a network, roads. Trails climbed ridgelines, dropped into valleys, crossed high passes, and threaded through places where a single misstep could mean a fall into thin air. Along these routes, the Inca built way stations and storage sites, creating a rhythm of movement across the Andes. Food could be kept where famine might strike. Supplies could be staged where storms might trap travelers. And information, urgent, fragile, could travel faster than a human body should be able to endure at altitude. The empire's reach depended on motion, and motion depended on preparation. But the Inca were not only builders of roads. They were builders of systems that made roads meaningful, coordinated labor, strategic agriculture, and the management of water. Terraces expanded across slopes like stone staircases for crops. Irrigation channels carried life into high basins. In a landscape where nature could cut off a community overnight, an organized surplus was not luxury. It was survival and power. A state that could feed people in harsh years was a state that could demand loyalty in return. In the Andes, food is never just food. It is security, memory, leverage. Then there is the sacred valley, where the mountains narrow and the river runs like a silver thread through a green corridor. The valley is dramatic not because it is beautiful, though it is, but because it feels engineered by both geology and human ambition. Peaks rise as if they are closing in, and yet the valley floor becomes a stage for agriculture, settlement, and ceremony. It is here that the Inca worldview becomes easier to sense the belief that the landscape is not random, that certain places are charged with meaning, that stone and sky can be arranged into a kind of dialogue. Machu Picchu sits within that dialogue like a question carved into rock. Perched above steep slopes, surrounded by rugged peaks, it looks less like a city dropped into nature and more like a structure that negotiated its right to exist there. The terraces hold the mountain in place as if the site's first task was simply to keep the earth from sliding away. The stonework is so precise, it appears to reject time blocks fitted so tightly that the joints seem invisible, as if the builders were trying to erase the idea of separation. And the location itself hints at intention, hidden, elevated, protected by geography, yet still connected to the broader world through trails that link ridge to ridge. But this is where history turns. Because even the most carefully organized mountain systems are vulnerable to forces they cannot predict, disease, political disruption, and the arrival of a foreign power that brings a different kind of violence. The Spanish conquest did not simply defeat the Inca in a straightforward military contest. It collided with an already strained world. Internal fractures and succession tensions weakened unity. And then epidemics arriving through networks of contact moved faster than armies. In a society built on coordinated labor and shared systems, sudden demographic collapse is catastrophic. Roads still exist, terraces still hold soil, but the bodies that maintain them disappear. The landscape remembers what people once managed, and it also reveals what happens when management breaks. Peru's colonial period shifted the axis of power. The highlands remained crucial, but coastal centers, especially Lima, became administrative engines tied to overseas empires. The coastline, once defined by desert scarcity and river oases, now hosted a city designed to govern a vast region and extract value from it. The logic changed. Where Andean systems prioritize storage resilience and integration across ecological bands, colonial systems often prioritize export hierarchy and control. Silver became one of the metals that rewired the region's fate. Wealth pulled from deep earth, moved across mountains, shipped across oceans. And with extraction came forced labor structures and new forms of inequality. Peru's landscapes, mountains, valleys, ports, were reinterpreted as pipelines. Routes that once carried food and messages now carried raw material. The same Andes that demanded local wisdom became obstacles to be exploited, crossed, or subdued. Yet culture did not simply vanish or become overwritten. It transformed. Belief systems blended. Languages persisted. Rituals adapted. Architecture carried old techniques into new forms. In many places, the mountains still shaped what was possible, regardless of who claimed authority. Communities that farmed terraces continued to depend on them. People continued to read seasons the way their ancestors had. The empire on paper might change, but the land's demands did not. And exploration, if it can be called that, continued in a different way. Europeans mapped routes, cataloged resources, and renamed places sometimes, treating a living homeland as if it were an empty discovery. But Peru was never empty. Even the most remote valleys had stories. Even the highest passes had been crossed long before foreign eyes arrived. What changed was not the existence of knowledge. It was whose knowledge was considered official. Over time, Peru's identity became layered. Andean foundations, imperial impositions, and modern nationhood emerging from the tension between them. It is why Peru's history feels like a landscape itself, stratified, tilted, and alive with fault lines. The Inca roads still run through mountains, even if many are now walked by trekkers instead of messengers. The terraces still stitch slopes, even if their original state structures no longer exist. Colonial cities still hold plazas and cathedrals, even as indigenous traditions continue to pulse beneath and around them. And now the question that haunts this part of the story is not simply what happened. It is what survived and at what cost. When a society is built to master altitude and water, and then the center of power shifts toward ports and exports, what gets lost? And what remains so deeply rooted that no conquest can fully remove it? Modern Peru is often introduced through its icons, high stone ruins, rainbow-striped textiles, a sacred valley under dramatic peaks, an Amazon that seems infinite from the air. But living inside a landscape like this is not the same as visiting it. Peru's present is shaped by a set of pressures that move in opposite directions: the desire to protect what is rare, the need to earn a living from what is valuable, and the reality that the environment itself is changing faster than many systems can adapt. In the Andes, one of the most quietly urgent stories is water. For generations, glaciers and high snowfields acted like reservoirs, releasing meltwater through the dry season and helping sustain rivers that feed valleys and cities. But as temperatures rise and ice retreats, the timing of water can shift: more runoff, now less later, more uncertainty when the rain fails. The change is not always dramatic in one moment. It's felt in the slow narrowing of margins, farmers guessing when to plant communities, watching springs weaken cities competing for supply, and hydroelectric planning becoming harder to predict. In Peru, water is the bridge between geology and daily life. And when that bridge starts to wobble, everything on it feels unstable. The same mountains that once made the Incas' logistics legendary now intensify modern risks. Steep slopes and fragile soils mean landslides remain a constant threat, especially when extreme rainfall events arrive. Roads can vanish overnight, turning a region into an island. Supply lines break, emergency response slows, and in remote areas, isolation can still mean the difference between inconvenience and catastrophe. The Andes demand infrastructure, but they also punish it, forcing maintenance to become a permanent requirement rather than a one-time achievement. In the Amazon, the pressure looks different, but it is just as heavy. The forest's value has always been misunderstood by outsiders because it doesn't always translate into immediate profit in the way a mine or a plantation does. Yet the Amazon is not simply trees. It is climate regulation, biodiversity medicines not yet discovered, and cultural homelands where knowledge is carried in language ceremony and the daily practice of living with the river. When deforestation accelerates through illegal logging, land clearing, or gold mining, the damage is not only ecological, it is social and spiritual. Rivers can become polluted. Fish become unsafe. Communities are pushed into conflict with outsiders and sometimes with the state itself. And that is where Peru's modern dilemma sharpens development, is often framed as a choice between poverty and progress. But the reality is more complicated. Resource extraction can bring roads, jobs, and revenue, and it can also bring contamination, corruption, and displacement. In some regions, people live inside that contradiction. They need opportunity, yet they also understand that once a river is poisoned, a forest stripped, a mountain scarred, the cost is not temporary. It is generational. Meanwhile, tourism, one of Peru's most visible industries, creates its own double-edged story. Places like Machu Picchu have become global magnets, bringing income and international attention. But being seen by the world can become a burden. Foot traffic wears down paths. Demand reshapes local economies around visitor expectations. Housing prices rise. Jobs shift toward service work that can be seasonal and unstable. Conservation rules become stricter, sometimes clashing with the needs of residents who have lived near these sites long before tourists arrived. Protecting a place can mean limiting access, but limiting access can also mean limiting livelihood. The question becomes political and personal. Who gets to benefit from heritage? And who is asked to sacrifice for it? Yet Peru's living culture is not only defined by struggle. It is also defined by endurance and creativity, by the ability to carry tradition forward without freezing it in time. In Andean towns, markets still function as social, heartbeat, color, texture negotiation community. Textiles are not mere souvenirs. They are coded histories in thread patterns that identify region family meaning. Food culture tells another story of fusion and adaptation. Indigenous crops and techniques meeting colonial influences, coastal seafood traditions, meeting highland staples, modern culinary innovation rising from ancient ingredients. Even the soundscape of Peru can feel like an echo chamber of centuries' languages, spoken side-by-side music, moving through plazas, festivals, turning streets into living memory. There is also a modern reassertion of identity. Indigenous communities and activists increasingly speak not only as heritage, but as political actors, demanding rights, land protections, and respect for knowledge systems that were long dismissed. Conservation efforts now in many places acknowledge that protecting biodiversity often works best when local communities are empowered rather than excluded. The most hopeful model is not a museum-like preservation that removes people from nature. It is stewardship humans as part of the ecosystem's stability. Still, the pressures are real and they converge. Climate stress complicates agriculture. Economic needs push extraction. Tourism pushes visibility. Urban growth pulls people away from rural lifeways, sometimes weakening the transmission of knowledge. And in the background, the Andes and Amazon continue to do what they have always done: impose limits that can't be negotiated away by policy alone. So Peru's modern identity becomes a tightrope. It is a country trying to be both a sanctuary and a marketplace, a living culture and a global destination, a homeland and a resource frontier. The same landscapes that make Peru unforgettable also make it fragile, because what is rare is often easy to damage and hard to restore. And that leads to the final question: when a place becomes famous for its beauty, how does it protect itself from the very attention that beauty attracts? And in a century where climate and economy both accelerate, what does it mean to choose a future that still leaves room for mountains, rivers, forests, and the people who belong to them? Peru is often photographed as a collection of highlights: one perfect ridge, one ancient wall, one river bending through green. But the deeper truth is that Peru is not a set of images. It is a system, a conversation between plates, colliding beneath the ocean mountains, lifting into thin air glaciers, rationing water forests, breathing humidity into the sky and communities, learning generation after generation how to survive on terrain that never promises comfort. It is a land where altitude rewrites the body, where weather teaches patience, where the past is not buried but exposed terraces stitched into slopes, roads that still remember footsteps, stones placed with an accuracy that feels like devotion. It is also a land where the future has begun to press hard against the present ice-retreating rivers, shifting their timing forests, threatened by short-term hunger for profit, heritage sites, straining under the weight of being loved too loudly. And maybe that is Peru's message, that beauty is never free. Not when it is carved by tectonic force. Not when it is maintained by human labor. Not when it is protected against the pressures of modern life. So what can be done beyond watching? The smallest action begins with attention that isn't shallow. Learn the difference between a place and a product. Travel. If traveling is possible with restraint, respect limits, follow local rules, choose operators that support communities rather than extract from them. Notice where the money goes. Notice who is asked to carry the burden of preservation. Support conservation work when it is led with local knowledge, not imposed against it. And speak about Peru not as a trophy, but as a living homeland, because language shapes what people think they're allowed to take. On a map, the edge of the world is just a borderline. But Peru reminds us that edge can also mean a threshold between ice and sun desert, and ocean mountain and forest, past and future. The real question isn't whether Peru will change. It will. The question is what kind of change the world will push onto it, and what kind of change we can choose instead.